All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our first afternoon session titled From Attribution to Accountability, Upholding International Rules Online. Please help me welcome our panelists on stage.
Okay. The order that we're all right. Right.
Thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Stiefel, and I'm the moderator for this afternoon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at a Bay Area-based nonprofit called the Institute for Security and Technology. But in my prior life, I had the great fortune of working with Liesl in the U.S. government. We are excited to have you all here for this conversation. Hopefully you can hear me. We are going to save 10 minutes at the end for questions. When you do come up for questions, if you will please just make sure it's a question. And please, if you don't mind, state your name and your affiliation, but not your life history or career. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll try to it being almost the end of this conference, we'll try to have some levity talking about a very serious topic, and to keep you all awake after lunch, which is what I did on Monday, and it's a struggle, but we're here. So I'm, again, delighted to be here, and I will pass it down to Liesl to introduce herself, please.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Liesl Franz. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Cyberspace Security in the Department of State's Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Middleton. I'm the Cyber Director at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and pretty much Liesl's counterpart, give or take.
Give or take, that's right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Amy Hogan-Burney from Microsoft. I lead our cybersecurity policy and protection team, which includes both our digital diplomacy team and our digital crimes unit.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Horowitz. I'm a legal advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross, based out of our Washington, D.C. office, which has the lengthy name of our ICRC delegation to the United States and Canada. So we hold the institutional relationship with the U.S. and Canadian governments.
Thanks, everyone. So I think you all know why we're here, right? We're here to talk about, with the escalating attacks online, many times, not all cases, launched by states, how do we manage attribution in this case, and how has that process evolved over time? So we will go back a little bit in history, almost a decade, actually 11 years, in our conversation, but we'll also cover some of the more recent incidents of attribution, and really hopefully talk a little bit about how we can continue to evolve this collaboration between industry, government, and other nonprofits. I think it's a critical time to be having this conversation. We really need to be thoughtful in how we continue to work to uphold the rule of law online. And so I'm really grateful that we have this great set of panelists to talk about it. So we're going to begin with Liesl and with our government friends. They knew this. They knew it was coming first. So just off of the brief introduction I gave, excuse me, can you discuss a little bit about how you all approach and who is involved in conducting, and the factors you consider in conducting public attribution of a cyber incident?
Thanks, Megan. Well, first of all, I want to level set by saying you mentioned political attribution or public attribution. That is one kind of attribution. Technical attribution is another, where you're looking at the ones and zeros, shall we say, to figure out the track of the traffic and where the attack is coming from. Once that has been established, then we can focus on the political or public attribution. And there are any number of, and in the U.S. government anyway, nothing is easy, but we're trying to make it as quick and easy as possible these days after, as you say, a decade of practice, sadly. We have a process by which interagency entities, those with equities or interests, have a deliberative discussion about the need, value, and effect of a public attribution. And by that we mean a public statement, generally, but not only, by either the Department of State or the White House, to call out and point the finger, shall we say, at another state who is engaging in malicious cyber activity. Often that's at the United States when we're having that discussion, but not only. We can also be supportive of other countries who are looking at malicious cyber activity. And so we can either have a public statement, or we can support another country's public attribution or political attribution. We do take a very collaborative approach with a lot of countries as well to do that, so that we're coming out not only generally by ourselves, but that we're coming out with a team of countries that view this activity as either contravening the norms of responsible state behavior that have been set out through the United Nations, or is enough of a concern that it's because it's destructive, disruptive, or otherwise destabilizing, and can also cause us great concern. The coordination happens internally within the U.S. government and externally with our partners and growing number of countries that are working with us to provide such attribution. Not every country will necessarily say it was a certain state, but they can also choose to, and often do, choose to condemn the behavior or support our statement. I'll leave it there for now.
Well, shall I try and add to that? So look, first say why we do this. We do this because sometimes resilience is not enough. Sometimes the attacks get through, and we want to impose some kind of cost. Effective cyber deterrence requires some cost. There are a number of ways to do that, but attributing responsibility for cyber attacks directly to a state is a form of cost. It's a cost to their reputation. It's a cost to their attempt to disguise what they're doing, to hide what they're doing. But it also raises awareness. It raises awareness for our own domestic constituency. So those cybersecurity network defenders, what is happening, what is the threat they need to prepare for, and who those threat actors look like. But it also raises awareness for the broader international community. So if a state is conducting this against us, may well be conducting it against you and you as well. So we're trying to raise awareness and also impose some kind of cost on the state to their broader international credibility. So when that state may bring a proposal in a UN negotiation, we can point to a series of cyber attacks that may contradict their overt statements. So it is a form of cost. As Liesl said, three-step process for us. Technical attribution first, that's led by our National Cybersecurity Centre. Then a policy process led by the Foreign Office in our system. Because it's a political statement, an attribution, the decision lies with our Foreign Secretary. It deals with state relations. But we run a cross-government process to make sure everybody is on board with that, and then we provide advice to the Foreign Secretary, and if necessary, the Prime Minister. Depends on the level of the case. And then the third step is international coordination, as Liesl says. The things that we really focus on, we do not attribute every attack. We try and look at patterns behavior and then running a campaign in response in order to change those patterns of behavior. And that may be both to change the behavior of the adversary or to change the behavior of our domestic constituency or the broader international community. So we've moved to this, instead of incident response, attributions responding to incident, attributions responding to or part of broader campaigns. And that will be linked with other measures from law enforcement to sanctions to kind of other cyber resilience steps.
Thank you. It's heartening to hear about the campaign-oriented approach. We have, I think, come a long way quickly in this field. So speaking of coming a long way, the field has evolved thanks in part to the efforts of Microsoft and other private sector entities. So Amy, a similar question posed to you. What factors do you consider when conducting a public attribution?
Yeah, I think the interesting characteristic that we all share that you heard is why. So why would we be doing public attribution? Makes a difference in how and what we share. So the first thing is that Microsoft as a company tracks hundreds of nation-state actor affiliate groups and have been for quite some time. We made a decision several years ago that tracking actors was not enough. We needed to publicly share that information where we had it. And so the first thing is the technical attribution that we do through the techniques that the actor uses, the type of information that the actor is looking for. There are certain actors, as you know, that are solely engaged in espionage, those that are engaged in intellectual property theft. And then the other thing is we are not so hubris to think that we know everything, and so we always check with other third parties, such as government entities or other private sector actors, to make sure that our attribution is accurate. So the most important thing to us, regardless of how we are going to share or why we are going to share, is that we are accurate when we provide that information. When we do provide public information, in many cases, it is through the public sharing of blog postings with the technical information in order to protect our customers and broadly provide the techniques that the actor is using at the time. But there are other reasons and other ways that we share as well. We do provide information directly to governments around the world through referrals. And then the last reason which we do attribution is if we are going to file a court case. So we do have civil actions that have involved nation-state actors that are still open at this time. We have a case we previously called Strontium, which is affiliated with Fancy Bear, which is still open, where we have a special master, Russian-based actors. And in that case, when we go to court, it requires a substantial amount of evidence in order to indicate that we have a nation-state actor that is conducting malicious activity. So there are kind of three buckets that we would do attribution in this space.
So I was saying we were going to go back in time. So I was just about to start at the White House, I think, when the APT1 report came out from Mandiant. That was a huge step for industry. I think a few of us came from the world of counterterrorism, where it was, in many cases, or in almost all cases, the case that the government had all of the information. And it leveraged what it knew, or its relationships with industry. But it was, for me, that was like sort of a watershed moment of, oh my gosh, look at how much the private sector knows about what's going on. So in the years since, has the government's approach changed on getting the private sector involved in attribution? And what do you think of, what are the two factors, what are the two, there might be more than two. What are the factors that have contributed to that evolution? Either one of you, Lisa.
I mean, I'm happy to sort of say one of the evolutions that you're referring to is this increasing role that the private sector is playing in attribution and sharing that information with others on the threat actors. I mean, Microsoft certainly is one. FireEye first discovered SolarWinds. Other private sector players do put out a number of reports when they see activity and can provide the attribution and importantly the information that is useful for the community to defend themselves. We have, now it's important to say that when a private sector company does attribute, it's not the same for us as when we, as the United States government, can make our own attribution. However, it does provide some greater amount of information into the ecosystem. So for countries that do not have strong capabilities or face a major, to do a similar type of analysis, and they face a major incident, then they can refer to the materials that private sectors have, the private sector players have put out into the universe, and also can in often cases can assist with that investigation. And when that report provides technical information, that's of great value to those that are trying to grapple with the incident that's taking place. And sometimes it can happen. We mentioned our coordination processes that we do go through. I'm sure it's not always easy in the private sector But often that kind of reporting or that kind of analysis can come out before it can come out from the government. And one thing I forgot to mention is that a political attribution, as Will mentioned, is something we do when we come out as whether it's the State Department or the White House, calling out another state. We also have increasingly done a number of cyber security advisories that have the technical information that is of use to the community, and it can also point to a state. And that's more information than a political attribution. It's a slight nuance, but it matters to us when we are making that calculation about how public and how political to be about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've come a long way. 2016, we only just established the National Cybersecurity Centre. But so attribution has helped, but there's been throughout the development of that body, UK National Cybersecurity Centre, they deliberately baked in private sector cooperation at the beginning. So we run a program called I-100, where we bring together the private sector, sit alongside both our operational community and the assessment community. And when we draw together an assessment of who is responsible for a cyber attack, we use UK sovereign intelligence, partners intelligence, but also private sector threat reporting, as well as open source reporting. And we pull all that together into an assessment. In order to attribute, we require high confidence, high likelihood of any assessment in order to proceed. So there's been an evolution in that trust. And I think we've moved from a state where, at the beginning it would take months to run this process, to when we attributed responsibility for the Viasat attack to Russia at the outset of the Ukraine conflict. We turned that round in something like 24 hours. So we've moved to a much more kind of streamlined process, and actually Microsoft reporting in that case was, contributed to our assessment. There is, as Liesl said, there are things sometimes that the private sector can say that we would like to say, but we're not prepared to, because we don't necessarily have that high confidence. So it can feed information into the ecosystem, which will then allow more to flow. It can sometimes open up the debate, as it were, can aerate the issue, and sometimes that can generate further intelligence flows. So it can be helpful sometimes just to kind of prod the issue.
Mm-hmm. To your question about how we work with the private sector, I think there's more room to establish exactly how we can do that in going forward, but it's a valuable duality in any case.
So thinking about attribution, Jonathan, how is it different, or how are you observing it differently? We were talking that you spent time in areas of hostilities, conflict. They are looking at actual physical conflict as opposed to one and zeros conflict, so to speak. How would you see the differences in attribution?
Thanks for the question. So for those not familiar with the ICRC, we work primarily in situations of armed conflict, and I think what we've seen over the course of several years is increased military capabilities to use cyber tools and capabilities as means and methods of warfare, and because civilian populations are so connected to various digital infrastructures that provide them access to essential services, we want to ensure that those military capabilities are being used in compliance with international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict. And in doing that, one of the ways that compliance is achieved is through accountability. And accountability is really only possible through different types of attribution. So it's a bit of a long story, but I'm eventually getting back to your question. And some of the reasons the ICRC finds issues around attribution, which for us is really the who did what to whom and why types of questions, is because we're a neutral, independent, impartial humanitarian organization that has confidential conversations with parties to an armed conflict. So we do not do public attribution. It's not the way the ICRC works. But what we do need to do is we need to understand who did what to whom and why, to understand which rules apply. And that's the really important thing for us. So understanding if you're talking about a private individual carrying out a a malicious cyber operation in a situation of armed conflict, that may not be associated to the armed conflict. It might be for other reasons. So international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, wouldn't regulate that operation. On the other hand, you may have an individual that's doing it, and you have to go through different legal attribution analysis to find out if they are in some way, shape, or form connected to a state actor who's a party to an armed conflict, right? Because if that happens, now you see the rules of international humanitarian law would regulate that state actor and that individual conducting that operation. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is different types of cyber behavior, different types of cyber operations will engage different rules of international humanitarian law, right? So the humanitarian sector, medical actors are afforded specific protections. And so if there's a cyber operation against them, that's going to be a different conversation, for example, that the US would have with that party to an armed conflict than they would if it was a cyber operation that was directed at or incidentally harmed civilians who are not part of the humanitarian or medical community. On the question of how is all of this different, I would say some of it is different and some of it is not. You're always going to have difficulties in warfare knowing who did what to whom for what reasons. It could be because of the complications of the battlefield. It could be because you have actors carrying out covert operations. That can happen in cyberspace and that can happen kinetically. You can also have a lot of finger pointing in different directions. So that's all part of the battle space normally and is not unique to cyberspace per se. What I would say is when you try to track the breadcrumbs to find out who did what to whom, they're going to be found in different places, such as code, for example, and not in a house or at a factory or in a hospital with bombshells falling, to give an example of how it would work in the kinetic world. You're going to be speaking to different actors, right? The ICRC would have to be speaking to ICT professionals or others who know who was on their network when a cyber operation took place. And that's a whole different group of people that the ICRC is not familiar interacting with. And you're also going to have different issues around not only sort of who you speak to and what you talk to them about, but the other thing that's unique is that the legal interpretations in cyberspace are still debated in some ways, right? So there are big questions, which I won't get into now, is how do you define an attack under international humanitarian law? And what protections did international humanitarian law afford to civilian data, right? So these are things that at the same time, maybe there are some things that are the same, but also there are some things that are new when you deal with trying to understand who did what to whom for what reason.
So once that analysis has been conducted, who did what to whom for what reason, what recourse does a nation have?
So I would leave it to my government colleagues to talk through that process. There are a number of different ways that accountability can be achieved, both at the domestic level, at the political level, at the international level, of course, without prejudice to any particular state or non-state armed group. You have statements made by the ICC prosecutor about interest in understanding the relationship between cyber operations and war crimes. So there's a wide range of ways that accountability can take shape when it comes to international humanitarian law compliance.
Good. So in thinking about, again, attribution here, 2 years ago now, Liesl, the U.S. publicly attributed a cyber attack against Albania to an Iranian actor and went a step further to say that this attack violated international norms by targeting critical infrastructure. These norms some of us in this room have been working on for longer than we would care to admit, probably. Usually, though, these kinds of connections are not included in public attribution. So can you say a bit about why not, and should we expect more of this going forward?
I would love to think we never have to attribute a cyber incident or a cyber attack again, but somehow I don't think that's going to be the case. But you made an important distinction when we were able to say that the attack on Albania did transgress the norms of responsible state behavior. For anyone who doesn't know them, there are 11 norms. 3 of them are norms of restraint, and 1 of them is do not attack the critical infrastructure of another state that provides services to the public. So that's essentially the norm. The other 8 norms are more positive in nature, like protect your engage in cyber defense and respect human rights and things like that. So there are much more positive positive norms in that framework as well. But Iran's conduct in that case clearly disregarded the norms, and the particular one regarding critical infrastructure. And that kind of activity can have cascading effects on domestic, regional, and globally, and that can lead to escalation and conflict. So we felt because we could, in that case, tie this activity directly to one of the norms that had been affirmed in the framework, we felt it was very important to call that out because all United Nations member states have agreed to be guided by those norms, and we need to use a situation like that to uphold the framework for responsible state behavior. We need to hold it up so that we cannot let countries and states get away with contravening it when they have so clearly done so, especially when it can impact the lives of citizens. When we haven't, when we've made a public or political attribution and we have not necessarily called out a norm specifically, it may be because it doesn't fall neatly into the categories that were negotiated as the norms in the framework. But it still can be escalatory, it can still be unacceptable, it can still be destructive, disruptive, or destabilizing. Can you tell I like alliteration? So I really have glommed onto that phraseology. But that destabilizing aspect is also of great concern. And so you have seen statements come out from the United States and others that may not specifically implicate the norms, but in some cases it might contravene the spirit of the norms and the framework for responsible state behavior and general global cyber stability. So that's why we need to continue to do it. One of the things I didn't mention earlier as to why we do it, and Will, thanks for laying that out, was, the idea is that these political attributions are part of cyber deterrence, and deterrence is the goal is to, in theory, affect the activity, or affect the decision-making calculus that leaders or other countries may take to whether or not they engage in such activity. One could argue, as many do, that this hasn't necessarily changed the behavior of states. However, it sets down very important markers that Will laid out. Another thing is that when we do something like a political attribution or a public attribution, we are also engaging in one of the key tenets of our cyber deterrence strategy, which is transparency. And that gives us the opportunity to then, when you said what recourse do states have, they can take other activities to raise the cost for countries, whether or not it's because they don't have credibility if they're coming to the UN with a treaty document that they want you to sign that they're not going to sign up to, or because we're going to sanction them or indict some of the actors. Then we've put them on notice.
Yeah.
But it is worth saying, political attributions are normative themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are saying, implicitly, we would not conduct this kind of operation. And therefore, we are saying that's unacceptable. So even if we haven't managed to get 193 states to sign up to that particular norm defined like that, we are saying, normatively, that is irresponsible cyber behavior. And by building an international coalition, 38 states in the Microsoft Exchange server attack, we're building a broader consensus about what is normatively malicious cyber behavior. And we think that is itself
Yeah.
helpful.
So, Jonathan, coming back to you, we've talked a bit about state action, but international institutions will also have to do more to uphold expectations online, including international law. Last fall, the ICC prosecutor announced that his office would investigate cyber-enabled war crimes. How are you seeing public attribution supporting prosecutions or otherwise helping uphold international law online, including international humanitarian law?
Yeah, no, I think there continues to be a lot of work that needs to be done at the international level, but it often, I think, on this particular issue, does come back down to the national level. There is a lot of discussion around norms. Norms are very important, but norms are not necessarily adjudicable in a court of law. And I think this is something really important to keep in mind. It's one of the reasons why the ICRC continues to press on about the applicability of international humanitarian law, because it is binding legal rules that states and non-state armed groups and non-international armed conflicts must comply with. That is a different thing than norms. And in that space of legally binding rules, there are these sort of legal debates. Now, there aren't as many as there used to be debates around the principle of distinction and applying the principle of proportionality and needing to take all precautionary measures to minimize civilian harm. Those are rules of international humanitarian law. You can easily apply them to cyberspace in many ways, to cyber operations. Where the difficulty falls on things like definitions around an attack. That's a term of art in international humanitarian law, and with it means an attack, you must follow the principle of distinction, proportionality, and take precautionary measures. The definition traditionally has related to, well, the treaty law definition is acts of violence against an adversary in the offense or defense. And violence has traditionally been understood to be death, injury, or damage. Now raises the question, what type of damage? Physical damage, there's broad state agreement that yes, physical damage through a cyber operation constitutes an attack under international humanitarian law. But what about something that falls short of causing physical damage? Disabling a computer or computer network, loss of functionality, the shutting down of financial systems. Does that constitute an attack? Those questions, in order to reach levels of accountability in a court, whether domestic or otherwise, those types of interpretive debates will have to be somehow resolved. A similar debate, which the industry may be particularly interested in, is around the protections that international humanitarian law affords civilian data. Civilian objects are protected. Is data an object? States are debating this. The ICRC's view is that, for a variety of different reasons, civilian data should receive the same protections that civilian objects receive under international humanitarian law. But that just gives you a sort of sample or a taste of the type of work that needs to continue to be done, even at the national level, so it can, in a way, trickle up to the international level for reasons of enhanced compliance for international humanitarian law and accountability.
Much more work to be done, it sounds like. So you have job security just like the rest of us. Unfortunately, as Liesl said, I wish we wouldn't have this opportunity. So thinking about these attributing another attack, Will, in March, the UK government publicly attributed attacks on the UK Electoral Commission to a Chinese state actor. What was the intended impact of this kind of attribution, and is it serving its purpose?
Good final question. It's a really good example of actually what I was talking about in my kind of opening answer. So we've known about this attack for several years. The attack happened back in 2021. But we were, like everybody knows, 2024 is the year of elections. We are facing elections in the UK by the end of this year. We were very clear that we wanted to raise awareness about the threat to those electoral processes, because we can see what is happening behind the scenes, including, but not only this attack against the Electoral Commission, we are also seeing targeting of parliamentarians and other electoral processes. So 3 different audiences for this campaign. One is those UK systems, parliamentarians, the media, the Electoral Commission itself. Actually, it's interesting, when that Electoral Commission hack became known, all the talk in the media was that it was Russia. So one of the things we wanted to do was correct that sort of misunderstanding and say China is a sophisticated actor that is also targeting these institutions. But we really want these institutions to raise their resilience. So we've been doing lots of work with parliamentary security to get parliamentarians to understand their own cyber vulnerabilities, never mind other electoral processes. The second is that we want to shape this kind of international normative debate on what acceptable behaviour is. You know, we think it should be unacceptable to attack electoral processes, to try and distort democracy. This is a threat that we all face. We know that our adversaries are trying to undermine credibility of our democracies, and attacking electoral institutions is part of that. So we want to kind of start this normative debate around that, and that's why we took the attack against Russia back in December. We took it to the OEWG and secured, I think, 22 statements of condemnation against that. And the third is this reputational cost on China. We want to break the links between the Chinese state and its proxy contractors. We know that the Chinese use, non-state groups to carry out these cyber attacks. We want to break that link. We also know many of those contractors dislike being exposed like this, dislike the exposure and the risk to them as individuals, particularly if we then apply sanctions alongside. So not only does the Chinese state dislike it, and we've seen plenty of evidence of that, but the contractors, those proxy groups, also dislike being targeted in that way. So that is a clear aim for us, is to break that use of supposedly deniable proxy groups. And we've seen that in the Chinese response. The Chinese are trying to themselves launch attributions against the West, including the US and the UK. It's trying to denigrate the attribution process itself. At the same time, it's also trying to say there should be a global attribution process. So it's trying every angle. That tells us that the Chinese don't like this, that is having some effect on their behavior. So it is not stopping the cyber attacks. We know that is a strategic competition. But are we throwing grit into the wheels? Are we making it more uncomfortable for these adversaries? Is it better to do this than to leave it unsaid? We believe that's the right thing to do.
If I could just add on to the China piece from the private sector perspective. I will tell you that we have done our fair share of attributing cyber attacks to China. Immediately following, we always get a demand for all evidence in support of our attribution. And we always respond and say we are actually happy to provide all evidence regarding attribution, and we will meet you at the embassy at any time or location in which to review it with you. And then we never get another response after that. So it's a constant kind of process where we do see the same thing, which is to immediate denial and a demand for evidence in support, and then no subsequent follow-up to our offer to demonstrate our attribution.
And diplomatically, we always inform the Chinese in advance. So we always signal that before we go public. But we also say, look, we want this to accompany this with a more serious dialogue about what is acceptable and unacceptable. What can we say is off limits between our two countries? And if we got that kind of dialogue, then we would change our approach on attributions. If we had a seriousness of engagement from the Chinese, for example, then it would change our approach.
So, Amy, you were just speaking a bit about this, but what are the ways in which industry is working to improve the impact of its own public attributions on nation states, and what do you hope to see from governments going forward?
That's a great question. I would say first, I am very thankful for the attributions that governments have done, and we've come a long way, all of us, in this space. I think in 2016, when we filed the first civil case against Russian-based actors, we were so nervous about publicly putting this information in court filings. And I cannot tell you how it was just an incredibly stressful situation, both from the idea of, do we have the sufficient evidence in order to go to court? Is public attribution appropriate? And what are the consequences going to be as a private sector company alone? That was a long time ago. It doesn't mean we take it less seriously. It just means that our transparency over a period of time have allowed us to be far more forthcoming. But that's not alone. It's because governments around the world have made significant decisions in this space as well. I think going forward, what I would like to see is some more coordination in this space. So where we have the ability to raise concern and awareness together, we should absolutely do that. And to the extent that we are seeing cyber norms that we believe should be advanced broken, calling those out as well with the idea towards what type of consequences we can see in the future, especially with respect to those that are vulnerable populations, critical infrastructure, other things, people that are our customers that we really seek to protect, including, as you mentioned, democracy as well. So I think there's just a big surface area here for us to work together in order to continue attribution.
If I may, I think you touched on an important point of this coalition type of thing that we've been working toward, and that is to not the fear of being the consequences by doing it alone, right? So for countries who may feel as though that they are too concerned about, taking on the attribution to another state, we care very much about doing that together. We joined the attribution that Will talked about. We joined Germany in attributing malicious cyber behavior by APT 28 that targeted a German political party. Other member states of the EU have all come forward to disclose that activity, and that widespread nature of the activity does have not only widespread impact, but also provides a broader base of countries that can come together to call out that behavior, and it makes any kind of consequence or tit for tat much harder to do. And that is, if you heard Secretary of State Blinken during his keynote address yesterday, in the rollout of our new international cyber and digital strategy, one of the key framing concept for the strategy is digital solidarity, and that covers many, many things. But in the context of this conversation, it really refers to the standing together and standing with each other and calling out this activity together.
So I have one more question, but I want to make sure we save time for the audience question. So if you have a question, please make your way to the mic, and if no one does, then I will. Okay. But you, sir, there first. You beat him, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the session. In 2016, or 2020, the Russians had their disinformation campaign around the election, and would that be considered an attack? I think that was an interesting discussion of, is that an attack? And if so, what would you consider to be proportional responses for those types of attacks?
I'm going to suggest that Jonathan take that one.
Yeah, well, great question. So it's one that doesn't need to be dealt with in any specific context. So just to say, the ICRC is not going to comment on the behavior of any party to an armed conflict, per se. There's a great piece that my colleague wrote specifically about this issue, about how misinformation, disinformation, hate speech is regulated by international humanitarian law. The question of information that's specifically having the purpose of causing death, injury, or damage is something to really think about as to whether or not that does fit within the category of an attack. There are a number of considerations that could lead you to say, yes, it does, and other considerations based on facts that say that it may not. So that is certainly a consideration. The other thing is that you wouldn't call it disinformation or hate speech per se, but harmful information can certainly take the shape of violations of international humanitarian law on, for example, social media platforms, right? So acts of threatening violence with the purpose of terrorizing the civilian population, that's a violation of international humanitarian law. That can happen over a social media platform. The recruitment of child soldiers can happen over social media platforms. So that gives you a sense of at least how the ICRC is thinking about the relationship of limits and constraints that international law, specifically international humanitarian law, places on what we call misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech, maybe more broadly harmful information. But it's a difficult definition to come up with that captures the full range of issues that civilians end up struggling with in a battlefield context.
I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that one.
The only thing I would say is it's not in the context of this conversation per se, but the department has taken on a very active process and project on information integrity. And not that I want to take away from Secretary Blinken's speech here yesterday on Monday, but he also spoke on information integrity at the Summit for Democracy a couple months ago. So I would commend that to you, but not necessarily putting it in the context of this conversation. I think the definitional piece is difficult. The concerns are real. The arbiter of dis and misinformation is difficult, and I think rarely, I don't even know if I could say, but rarely would it be an attack per se, depending on the definition.
Sorry, you have to wait.
Hi, Rishi Iyengar with Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks for doing this. I have a three-part question, but I promise all three parts are short and very specific.
Okay.
So the breach this week of the UK Ministry of Defense, are you can you officially attribute that to China? What are you looking for? If not, what are you looking for to make that attribution? And at what point do your partners sitting on either side of you get involved in that process?
I think that's for you, Will.
Yeah, I think that's clearly for me. Well, so it's a pretty live incident. It only came public this week. For those who don't know, this was the Ministry of Defense payroll was hacked, and this sort of became public this week. Not least because we had to tell all those whose payroll was being disrupted. So we run an assessment process, as I say, and that process is ongoing. It's why we really cleared that we did not attribute, when the Defence Secretary stood up in Parliament, he did not formally attribute to China. There was some briefing which suggested that it was a state actor because of the type of attack and what we've seen so far. But there is an assessment process ongoing. And as we say, often that assessment process can take years as we gather information. Some of that is from partners, some of that is from the private sector, some of that is from open source, some of that will only come online downstream. So at this stage, that investigation is ongoing, and there's been no formal public attribution.
And I won't comment on that specific case, but I will tell you how we would be involved to the extent that it is a government customer. And we have observed activity that we believe that is either the targeting or compromise by a nation-state actor. We perform a direct notification to that customer and provide all information that would go towards attribution that they are able to use as they see fit.
Michael, you get the last question.
Michael Daniel with the Cyber Threat Alliance. So we've talked mostly about nation-state activity, but of course the majority of malicious activity in cyberspace is criminal. Ransomware has also reached the level where it is a national security threat. We typically talk about attribution to criminal groups as if they were state groups. We use the same sort of naming system and other things, but should we actually think about a different attribution method? It's one thing to attribute something to a state, which is something you can hold accountable, but I can't hold Scattered Spider accountable. Like, that's not a thing. So should we actually think about doing criminal attribution more on an individual basis, or actually naming names like Ivan Grozny, to actually help with the accountability?
I say yes. I mean, I think the answer to your question, personally, we, even in our civil cases, the last several that we have filed, where we have the name of an individual, we have actually pled them as a defendant, and we have prepared in court in a civil case for them to arrive if they ever decided to do so. Of course, I heartily say yes.
Yes, from me too. So you've seen the recent Lockbit takedown and sanctions by the UK's National Crime Agency and by the Foreign Office. So it was a coordinated campaign, took down the site, took over that site. I don't know whether any of you have been following the Lockbit website, but we basically, NCAA put a counter to the sanctions announcement this week. And that is a cognitive effect. We're trying to have a cognitive effect on those groups to say we can access and control their systems. And we're using that as a disruption technique. And then we apply a cybercrime sanction against one of the individuals, naming them in public, and applying some kind of cost. So, yes, they may stay outside our jurisdiction, but if they ever want a holiday in Spain, they know that they're going to get picked up. That we feel is a useful tool. In fact, a very similar process we go through to a political attribution.
Good. Well, you can approach the group maybe afterwards. I'm getting the stop sign, so it's not me, it's our dear host. So please join me in thanking the panel, and thanks for coming this afternoon.
Thank you.